Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and as is usually the case when I do a YouTube video, I sat down to write a blog post today, got tired of the writing, and decided to talk to a camera instead. Um, I'm pretty exhausted right now. I am taking my qualifying exams this January for my program, which, roughly speaking, these are the exams that will earn me my master's degree and transition me into the dissertation phase of my PhD. So, lots of work, very stressful, lots of reading, so much writing. I've been reading Henry Allison all day. You have no need to know who that is, he's a Kant commentator, it's not terribly important, but the point is, my brain is fried, and I just didn't have enough mental acuity to sit down and write a coherent blog post. So instead, you get to look at my face. Um, I thought today I would talk a little bit about the way that my reading style is starting to change as I work more with the Thoth Tarot. So, for anyone who's not familiar, I have started reading almost exclusively with Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris's Thoth deck. I grew up reading primarily Rider-Waite-Smith. My first deck was a Rider-Waite deck, and then our house was burgled, and the deck was one of the things stolen. So I sort of fell off from tarot for a while, and when I picked it back up, it was with a jeu de tarot, which is a playing deck for the French card game. Let's see if I can get rid of the glare. For the French card game of tarot, which is a trick-taking game kind of similar to Bridge. And if you've never seen a deck like this, it's basically just a deck of playing cards. So you have trump cards like that, but they just depict scenes from sort of French colonial life. They have nothing to do with divinatory meanings of the cards, and then the minor arcana are just playing cards. So this is the deck that I really learned how to read tarot seriously with. And there are a lot of good things that came out of that. It was a really good way to force myself to know card meanings and not rely too heavily on card imagery, and instead really read sort of systematically with suit and elemental dignity and number and things like that. But one of the things that happened sort of as I grew up reading tarot, and particularly growing up reading tarot and being very suspicious and skeptical of anything that smelled too woo-woo, right? Because I grew up and I was an atheist for a very long time, and I, for a long time, really deeply believed that, atheism and scientific materialism was just the way to view the world if you were halfway intelligent. And it was the thing that smart people did, and the only reason to live in an enchanted universe was if you were a sheep or if you were trying to control the sheep. This is an attitude I inherited from my father, and it's a deeply Marxist attitude, although he would be horrified if he knew that that's how I explain his position to other people. But so when I grew up reading tarot, I made a point to make everything very abstract, metaphorical, and psychologized. Right? So I would read tarot, and I would not comment on other people in the querent's situation. I would not comment on any kind of information that the querent didn't have. I wouldn't make predictions about the future. My stance on tarot really was, I am just reading cards to provide you with a different narrative perspective on the situation you're already familiar with. And I think there's value in that kind of reading for certain kinds of querents and for certain kinds of questions, right? There's nothing wrong with a more psychological model of tarot. But as I have sort of progressed in my own life, started practicing Wicca, landed much more squarely in the realm of the woo-woo and the occult, I've started wanting to use tarot more and more for genuine fortune-telling-y divinatory purposes, right? I've started wanting to use tarot to acquire information that I didn't previously have, as opposed to just reflecting on information that I have and need to process. And I think that's part of why I had started to feel a little burnt out with tarot, is that I felt like this tool I was used to using in a certain way wasn't fitting the needs that I had. The purposes that I wanted to use it for, or at least the way that I was accustomed to using it wasn't sort of matching up with the kinds of questions I was asking. And for anyone who's not familiar, starting in about August of this year, I really fell in love with Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris's Thoth Tarot deck. Um, the artwork just really started to speak to me, and I found that this was really the only deck I wanted to be using. It read really cleanly for me, it was really easy to use, and simultaneously most of my other decks, of which there are many, I think I'm close to like 60 decks now. Anyways, most of my other decks I was just having a real hard time pulling information out of. So I started using the Thoth almost exclusively, and in early November of this year, I made a commitment to myself, and then I publicized the commitment on the internet, that I would read exclusively with the Thoth deck for at least the next year, and just see how that goes. And it's been a really interesting transition. I'd always been moderately competent with the Thoth, but certainly not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I maintained, and still maintain, that any sufficiently advanced tarot reader should at least be able to read in the three main tarot schools, right? So Rider-Waite-Smith, Thoth, and Tarot de Marseille. These are the three biggest traditions of tarot, and almost every deck on the market is strongly influenced by one of these three. There are a couple of exceptions. So Wildwood Tarot, Mary L. Tarot, there are a couple of other sort of major decks on the market that are different enough from most of the other tarot decks on the market that they kind of sort of represent traditions unto themselves. Traditions unto themselves. I know how to speak clearly. I am a native English speaker. Diction is a thing. Anyways. So I always felt that, a sufficiently advanced reader should be able to read with these three decks. But I never had much interest or much patience for the Thoth Tarot. And so learning to work with it as my main deck has really been a matter of relearning tarot from the ground up. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that I read this deck much more literally than I had been reading with Rider-Waite-Smith or Tarot de Marseille. That's not to say that you can't read more literally with those decks. I think you certainly can, and there are people who are very good at it. But I think in part because those are the styles, those are the schools of tarot that I grew up reading. And so when I look at a Rider-Waite type deck, I sort of go into, I fall into my old habits and my ways of interpreting the cards that were much more psychological and, oh, well, the Queen of Wands represents an aspect of yourself that is, very warm and charismatic and so on. And I don't have as much of a history with the Thoth Tarot, so it's easier for me to separate out sort of my old reading habits and start fresh with this deck, which has been really nice. And the other big reason that I'm finding it easier to be a little more literal with this deck is, and I've written about this before, I have a post called, oh gosh, I think it's called, Why I Don't Read Oracle Decks. I'll see if I can find it and link it in the description of this video, where I point out that in some ways the Thoth Tarot is more like an Oracle deck than Rider-Waite or Tarot de Marseille. Because all of the minor arcana, I just pulled a couple of cards at random here, what do we have? We have the Six of Wands and the Two of Wands here. And all of the minor arcana have titles of their own. So the Six of Wands is called Virtue, the Two of Wands is called Dominion, and you have other, the Three of Swords is called Sorrow, and the Ten of Discs is called Wealth, and every card has a title of its own. Which means that when I'm reading with the Thoth Tarot, even before I fall into sort of the more systematic, analytical style of reading, which I still do, right? I'll still look at elemental dignity and runs of numbers and things like that. But before I get there, before I get to the hyper-analytical part of my mind, I'm just looking at these cards and I'm seeing, okay, so we have Dominion next to Wealth, and then we have, the King of Discs over here, and that's a banker. And so we have someone who has dominion over your wealth. It's very easy for me to read the Thoth deck almost as if it were just a straight-up Oracle deck, and just to read the titles of the cards and run from there, and knit together a really clean story without having to fall back on these very intellectualized, abstract reading methods. It's easy for me to just sort of open my mouth and go. And for someone who spends a lot of time up in his head, for someone who is very intellectual, a little hyper-intellectual, I find it's really beneficial for me reading with the Thoth Tarot and being able to turn off the more active thinking part of my mind and just sort of read, much more intuitively. I used to have I'm not terribly proud to admit this, I used to have a lot of scorn for people who described themselves as intuitive tarot readers, because I always took intuitive reader as sort of a code for untrained reader, right? I always thought that people who marketed themselves as intuitive readers were people who hadn't bothered to learn the actual traditions of, like, what the cards mean and how they relate to each other. And, I think there's certainly an element of that. I think there's a temptation for people to fall back on intuition more so than on, or not more so than, but at the expense of having learned, sort of received wisdom about tarot and tarot card meanings. But at the same time, intuition is a really necessary part of divination of any kind, right? It's a necessary part of tarot. It's also a necessary part of, I Ching, or, well, less so with I Ching. I Ching is pretty mechanical. But scrying or tasseography or, whatever. Russian Thavomancy. God, I had such a kick where I really wanted to learn Russian Thavomancy. Thavomancy is divination by beans. And didn't love that system. Wasn't for me. But there's something about it that just seemed so cool. But the point that I'm trying to make, and I'm distracting myself here, is that even if, like me, you are a very intellectual person and you rely a lot on the internal structure of your divinatory system, you still need that intuitive spark to get things going. And I think in particular reading with Rider-Waite style decks, had fallen into this rut where I was reading tarot mechanically and I wasn't letting a lot of intuition shine through. And I wasn't having that sort of creative, subconscious connection of, oh, I see this symbol and I think it means this and here's the story I'm going to tell. Which is, at bottom, the skill that you need to be expressing in order to divine competently. So I've just found that my switch over into reading with the Thoth, I think in part because of sort of the nature of the deck itself and the way that the cards are titled, but also in part because it's a deck that I have so much less history with, and I really am relearning tarot for myself, and in some ways coming at it as a novice again. It has been really wonderful, and has opened me up and allowed me to be more flexible and more intuitive in a way that has really benefited my divinatory practice. So that's kind of all I had to say today. I know I'm rambling. You just get sort of 15 minutes of my face and me avoiding work, and then I have to go back into the fray. But yeah, it's been quite an experiment. It's been quite an adventure. I still have 11 more months of exclusive Thoth reading to go, and we'll see how it goes. So that's all I have. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope you have good winter holidays if you celebrate them of any variety. And I'm gonna be very, very busy until sometime in mid to the end of January because I'm gonna be working so much. I don't know how active the blog is gonna be, but I am gonna try to put some stuff up. So with that, yeah, goodbye.